Thank you for that very nice introduction, Emily. Thank you to Diana and, of course, to Hunter Braithwaite, editor of the Miami Rail. I guess he's the reason, ultimately, he's the source of my coming here to speak to you tonight about this. It's going to be, hopefully a kind of dialogue will emerge between my book and the show. And I wanted to begin by saying that I think that more than any exhibition I've seen recently, this one, do you know, these people at the museum, they were going to give me a book to rest me, this one, Image Search. It really takes us deep into a consideration of the meaning of photography, both as it's used at present and as it's unfolded throughout its long history. Those of you who've seen it will know it's an incredibly sensible exhibition, a very sensible way of investigating the various ways in which a photograph can be classified or categorized to facilitate its being found. So I thought it would be really quite useful to compare that show with an altogether less sensible, I mean perhaps even silly way of organizing things in that book of mine that Emily mentioned, The Ongoing Moment. And hopefully this will enable us to delve further into the issues raised by the show. It will also, I'm pretty confident of this, it'll show how quickly the sensible and the silly or the idiosyncratic start melting into each other in a way that I hope you'll agree is entirely appropriate. The silly approach might even end up seeming every bit as sensible as the approach that you get in Image Search. Now you'll see on the Image Search website that you've got the choice of searching either by artist or by keyword. Under artist you get everybody from Berenice Abbott to Gary Winogrand, so that's straightforward enough. But I think it's quite interesting, potentially slightly confusing, that under keywords, as well as the expected things such as nudes, portraits, cityscapes or whatever, you also get the names of artists, so that Winogrand and Abbott, they're keywords too. And if you like, I think this is really the tangled knot at the center of the huge ball of string that is photography. You pull it one way and it starts to unravel, you pull it the other and things get tighter and tighter. Because in a sense, so much I think that's intrinsic to the debate about photography comes down to that simple double-barreled question, who by, what of? That is to say, is a photograph defined by what it's of, that is to say a nude, a cityscape, a vase of flowers, or who it's by? That is to say, Berenice Abbott, Gary Winogrand, or whoever else. And I think it becomes still more of an issue really, because while we might pride ourselves on being able to recognize the style of a particular photographer, that style is so often manifested by the photographer being able to lay claim to a particular kind or type of content. Would we be able to recognize a given picture by a certain photographer without the help, without being familiar with the kind of stuff that they tended to photograph, without the help of the content? I mean, when we talk about a photographer's style, we tend to refer, what we're tending to refer to, I think, is the stylization of a particular kind of content. So I think that's something to bear in mind, the stylization of a particular kind of content. And we can give an example of this. Dorothea Lang, let's see how we go. How do I initiate the whole thing? Do I point it at the projector maybe? Oh, there we are. Is that the first picture or the second, by the way? Okay, great. So I pointed at the screen, Emily, is that right?
Up here.
Yeah. Up there, okay. Yeah, here we go. So Dorothea Lange, she took a lot of pictures of people's backs in the Great Depression. So we see a picture like this one, and this one, and, you know, this one. Whoops, it's a very sensitive clicker. There we are. And, you know, in every important way, if we're looking at one of these photographs, we'd really be very confident. We'd say without any hesitation, yeah, it's Dorothea Lange. She took pictures of people's backs, and it's all very, very Dorothea Lange-like. But the thing is, cases of mistaken authorial identity are very, very easy. Because, you know, this one, this absolutely classic Dorothea Lange shot, it's not by Dorothea Lange at all, it's by Ben Shahn. And there are loads of interesting, I think, examples of this. Walker Evans is a particularly sorry, that's not such a good image. But Walker Evans is a particularly interesting case. Someone whose highly distinctive take on the world was characterized by its being so sort of stylistically neutral as to be almost anonymous. But this style, documentary style as he called it, became readily recognizable. And it's true, it really is, you know, it's incredibly distinctive. Here's another Walker Evans picture, a classic Walker Evans picture, except it's by an FSA, another FSA photographer whose name I suspect will not be so familiar. It's by somebody called Carl Meidens. Here's another one, another classic Evans. This classic Evans is by Dorothea Lange, while this classic Dorothea Lange turns out to be by Russell Lee. Honestly, we could keep going on like this forever, pointing out this kind of thing, but what I'd like to do now is look at a slightly different version of things. When Edward Weston was being driven around, or more accurately, being driven around by Charis Wilson, well, maybe she was by then his wife. First, you know, she began as his model, became his girlfriend, and then his wife in the 1930s. He'd apparently fall asleep and say to Charis, "Wake me up when you see an Edward Weston." And this didn't mean wake me up when you see a nude woman in the sand dunes. But yeah, in the course of that trip, he duly photographed lots of things that we identify as Western-like or Westonian. But in the course of their last big road trip, he also ended up seeing or doing a Walker Evans. I mean, he's actually there, very close to a place where Walker Evans took this photograph in the 1930s. They make their way east, and they end up in New York, where he ended up doing, with that picture, he ended up doing a kind of Berenice Abbott. The first one was by Weston, is the point, the second by Berenice Abbott. And he also ended up doing, with this picture, he ended up doing a Stieglitz. And I think the interesting thing about this phase of Weston's work is the question, I mean, did he know this? Was he conscious of doing that? I mean, we'll come back to that exact question with reference to Edward Weston at the end. When we look at this picture, but you know, did he have Paul Strand in mind when he took this picture? We'll talk more about Strand in a moment, but for now I'd like to just observe parenthetically, really, that just as other photographers turn out to have done Langes and so forth, I'm struck by how many of the great photographers turn out to have made pictures which were really quite far removed from the kind of work that we immediately associate with them. Even ones with very, very strong, instantly recognizable artistic identities end up doing work which could easily pass as being by someone else. I'll give you a very quick example of this. Edward Weston. Of course, very, very famous for his nudes, and in the show there are various sort of takes on Edward Weston's nudes. Now, we don't associate Cartier-Bresson at all with this kind of thing, but that turns out to be a Cartier-Bresson whose range is so much greater than we associate with any idea of the decisive moments. It seems to me that the great photographers are all like Whitman. They are great. They contain multitudes. But let's go back to Paul Strand for the moment. Here he is. Yeah, here he is. Photographed by Stieglitz. In terms of an image search, this could be classified as picture of an artist in his studio. But of course, it's doubly interesting because it's not just a picture it's not just a picture of Paul Strand. It's a picture by Stieglitz. On the other hand, just to sort of mirror things, this is a picture of Stieglitz by Strand, and I'm sure you know quite a lot about their relationship and friendship. And so, well, I'll just say that these pictures are, if you like, doubly interesting. It's like a kind of who by what of squared. Each of these two pictures, I think, is twice as interesting as it would be if it were done by some random third person. Now, as you all know, one of the things that makes photography so fascinating is the way that different people can take pictures of the same thing and it comes out differently. This was put so well, really quite movingly, in fact, I think, by William Gedney, after he'd been looking at some pictures of by E.J. Belloc of those Belloc pictures of prostitutes in New Orleans, and Gedney said that the same woman could be posed in the same way, in the same setting, in front of the same camera, and it could be photographed by 100 different photographers. And then he said this: it's a continually amazing thing that this impersonal machine, the camera, should render not only the surface of the visible world, but is capable of rendering so sensitively the personality of the photographer. So there we get it again, this sort of interface between what the photograph is of, the external world, and who it's by, the personality of the photographer. And of course, the photographer's relationship with the subject is really important, and it happens that we can come up with quite an easy test of this claim of William Gedney's, and we'll go back again to Charis Wilson, or Charis Weston. Here she is, photographed by her husband, Edward Weston, at Lake Adisa in 1937. And I'm sorry, it's a rather poor quality picture, but it's an amazing, really quite incredible picture. And it turns out that it was one of these kind of three-way type expeditions they were having, but only in the sort of camping sense, not in the sort of sexual sense, because Ansel Adams was with them, and he took a picture of Charis. And I think it's really, this is just a sort of documentary picture of Charis Weston. It doesn't have any of the kind of the magic, the love, the incredible smouldering sexiness that the picture that this picture has. Although I'm conscious that technologically the point has been somewhat undermined by the superior quality of the reproduction of the Ansel Adams that we're seeing. Anyway, so let's go back to this notion of the keyword search. It seems to me you could search, you could search for something like attractive woman in outdoor wear. But to be really accurate, to find this picture rather than one by their friend Adams, you'd have to refine your search further. You'd have to file it under, you'd have to look for, I don't know, women photographers were in love with. Whereupon, interestingly, of course, you'd also get a bunch of pictures by Stieglitz of Georgia O'Keeffe, or pictures of Rebecca Strand by her husband Paul, and you might end up wanting to add a distinction between the clothed and the unclothed. In fact, it turns out that you need to start adding an awful lot of information so that your search might well start taking the form of a very precise description, which, once you add some clarifying narrative components, ends up being a kind of story. You end up telling a story. That is to say, you might need to add so many of the things that are not normally part of a system of categories. Because those categories, in order to function as categories, they have to be resistant to the kind of changes that are ushered in by narrative, by stories. In other words, to go right back to the beginning, the classification starts to become a bit nutty. It starts to become fluid, to break down and become less rigid. Stepping back to Charis Wilson as photographed by Weston and Adams, I think it alerts us also to the way that by looking at how different photographers have photographed the same thing or the same person, it can bring out really quite strongly the distinctive qualities of the particular photographer. Put it like this, the who by often becomes more powerfully distinctive when the what of is the same. Often, but not always. I'll start with a couple of examples of things by photographers with a very strong authorial identity, which actually refute the claim that I'll go on to make. Here's a picture by Larry Burroughs, taken in Vietnam. Larry Burroughs, of course, great photographer, great war photographer, died in Vietnam. And here's another photograph by an equally well-known, readily identifiable photographer, the great Philip Jones Griffith. But I think it's fair to, and it turns out actually that this picture for Jones Griffith, he actually shot that in colour film, but then printed it as black and white. But I think you'll agree there's really not any significant difference between these two. You couldn't really you'd be hard pushed to make a very convincing case about the distinctive styles of Philip Jones Griffiths and Larry Burroughs based on these two pictures. So I think certain kinds of subject perhaps are more helpful than others, and here we get back to the idea of silliness, I think. In fact, I found that the more specific, the more ridiculously specific, the more helpful these subjects were. I'll say a little now about how I went about this in the ongoing moment, which began with the idea of looking at the way that the same subject cropped up in photographs by different photographers. But it wasn't going to be nudes or landscapes, it was just going to be funny things that caught my eye. Things like benches or stairs or empty roads or barbershops. And what I would do is, I had all these photography books at home, and then I'd just go through them and I'd put a kind of coloured post-it note on a particular kind of image type that I liked, and then I'd go to the photocopying shop, photocopy them, and arrange them all in different coloured folders. And it was incredibly like, at school sometimes you do art projects, and it always felt, whereas things like physics or maths felt like hard work, these kind of art projects where you just sort of make things, and it always just felt like messing around. And this early sort of phase of the book felt like that, so that when my wife would go to work in the morning, she'd say, you know, what are you going to be doing today? Playing with your coloured folders. And that's exactly what I was doing. And I knew right from the start, I mean, in a sense, the whole book, the idea for the book, for me, began with this picture, which you all know so well, I'm sure, Blind by Paul Strand. And so, basically, you know, I had this was the picture that started my yellow folder of pictures of blind people. And I knew also there were going to be pictures of people in hats. I was going to put them in a red folder, and then I was going to put people's backs in a blue folder, and so on. But so that's all quite straightforward, but it got incredibly complicated incredibly quickly, because was this picture, was that meant to go in a picture of blind people or hats? In other words, did I need a kind of orange folder for this picture? So, and similarly going back with this one, you know, there it is, a picture of backs, of somebody's back, which is also a picture of somebody's hat, blind people and hats. So, I mean, it was a real problem, but it was a very welcome one for me, because it was something that photographers had also grappled with. I mean, to go back to the Westerns again, Charis remembers that she talks about the ledger that Edward kept. And she says, he kept this ledger for years, in which he identified negatives alphabetically. N for nudes, T for trees, R for rocks, S for shells, CL for clouds. Not just C, because of course C had already been used for cactuses. So that, if you like, is just an administrative or filing issue. But in a way, it seems to me, it really gets to the essence of the medium. The essence of the medium, as so memorably expressed by Lee Friedlander when he was talking about an early picture of his. This is what Friedlander says. I only wanted Uncle Vernon standing by his own car, a Hudson, on a clear day. I got him and the car. But I also got a bit of Aunt Mary's laundry and Bo Jack, the dog, peeing on the fence, and a row of potted tuberous begonias on the porch, and 78 trees and 1,000,000 pebbles in the driveway, and more. It's a generous medium, photography, said Lee Friedlander. And that generosity means, I think, that pictures of backs or whatever are also pictures of benches and a whole load of other things as well. That's the first complicating factor. But then I think also we end up having to add in that idea which has become so popular and influential, I mean almost to the point of parody. That's Roland Barthes' idea of the punctum, whereby what a photograph declares itself to be about, what Barthes calls the studium, is different to the little detail that somehow moves or pricks him, the punctum he calls it. And you know, once you factor in that, then of course you've got a real recipe for confusion. So, I mean, just to illustrate this very, very briefly, here's a picture, of course, by William Klein. So you might search for William Klein or kids playing with guns. But of course, what Roland Barthes famously claimed to see was just one thing, this boy's incredibly bad teeth. So it seems to me it would not be sane to categorize this as a picture of bad teeth, but that's sort of what it is. And as I say, that idea of the punctum of Barthes has become really very, very influential. And it illustrates one of several ways in which I think it's very difficult for these categories to remain watertight. It's incredibly easy for them to start, I mean, they become very porous quite very, very quickly. The borders disintegrate. Once again, in different ways, you get narrative, you end up getting narratives, stories, and dialogue between photographers. And I was reassured about this this idea of very sort of fluid categories or classifications by a story by Borges. Famously, Borges was blind, so this is a picture of a blind person, but it's also a picture of a famous author, and it's also a picture by Diane Arbus, so that's where, you know, that would crop up in many different ways in image searches. Anyway, in one of his great stories, Borges describes this fictional Chinese encyclopedia that he's come across, and according to this arcane work of reference, animals are divided into A, those that belong to the emperor, B, embalmed ones, C, those that are trained, D, suckling pigs, E, mermaids, F, fabulous ones, G, stray dogs, H, those that are included in this classification, I, those that tremble as if they were mad, J, innumerable ones, K, those drawn with a very fine camel's hair brush, L, etc., M, those that have just broken the flower vase, and N, those that at distance resemble flies. So it's a completely lunatic classification, the idea of which is to try to show us how arbitrary many of the systems of classification that we take for granted are. And when you look at the way that various photographers have attempted to come up with systems of labeling or categorize, they become quickly wonky and unstable too. Even one of the most significant and scientific ever attempted by August Sander in his People of the 20th Century. This is his classification. There are 7 main types: the farmer, the skilled tradesman, the woman, classes and professions, the artists, the city, and finally the last people. I mean, it's quite interesting, I think, hearing that immediately after the Borges one, because it turns, you know, they seem to have, seem to share that arbitrary quality. And then when you look at that last portfolio of August Sander's, you see that it's divided up. There are various subdivisions. So the last people, it comprises idiots, the sick, the insane, and it ends with pictures of the dead. So it's even something incredibly, you know, famously rigorous like that seems to have something rather arbitrary about it. I guess what I'd like to do now is move on and mention a few things that I've learned subsequently about what may be termed the problems of the image search. Just go on with this. At the beginning of the book, there's a long sequence of photographs of blind people. So I start with this one of Strand, by Paul Strand. Move on to this one of Evans by Walker Evans, because that picture, Blind, by Paul Strand, had a big effect on Walker Evans. And then, you know, to try to address this idea of whether people were conscious of each other, I look at various other things. So there's a picture by Bruce Davidson. It seems to me he must have had Walker Evans in mind. So what you get is this idea of these photographers kind of, I don't know, both looking at each other, in dialogue with each other, and kind of glancing over each other's shoulders when they're taking these pictures. And here's one. Yeah, here's a picture I'll just say something about. So it's a picture of a blind person, of course, and it's also absolute classic Gary Winogrand picture. It's quite interesting. I mean, I became really absorbed by this picture, and then I had the good fortune to go to the Center of Creative Photography in Arizona when the stupendously huge Winogrand, where the big Winogrand archive is kept. And it seemed to me, I was pretty sure that when I got to see the contact sheets, it would turn out that Winogrand saw this guy and thought, great, I'm really onto something here, and he would just he'd just stand there and see how different people interacted with this blind guy. But actually, when you see the contact sheet, I hope you can see it clearly, it turns out that wasn't the case at all. I mean, it's this with Winogrand with this kind of manic energy and sort of jitteriness. It's like he couldn't, unlike the blind guy who's standing there, he just couldn't stand still. It really surprised me that he moved on so quickly. Anyway, so it's a picture. It's, you know, we'd file it under street photography, maybe photographs of blind people, but actually, it turns out it's a different kind of picture as well. And if there are any men of a certain age in the audience, I can't tell. Maybe they will be able to say who that woman is. Is it just a random, in a sense it is just a, yeah, who is it? Yeah, who said that? I heard, but couldn't, right. And it's, so yeah, it's a picture of Ali McGraw. So it turns out that we have to file this under sort of celebrity pictures. And I love the way that effectively, you know, Winogrand has just papped Ali McGraw. So yeah, he's just papped her, and I should say it was actually Todd Papa George who pointed this out to me. And talking of Papa George and the way that different photographers photograph the same thing, I'll just show you very quickly a pair of pictures. Yeah, so that is that's a Todd Papa George picture from his series Passing Through Eden. Kind of amazing picture, actually. So weird. You know, what is going on there? What sort of relationship is being enacted? And then here's another picture of exactly the same thing, but not quite exactly the same thing. Do you remember that pairing of pictures of the by Larry Burroughs and Philip Jones Griffiths in Vietnam? I really couldn't see any difference between them, but you know, these two pictures are very, very nearly the same, but they're not quite. I mean, I think it's interesting as we look at it. This picture, which seems so remarkable on its own, that's the Papa George. Compared with the Winogrand, the Papa George starts to seem almost staged, doesn't it? And I like the way that you've got this guy stepping in from the side of the frame, almost like a representative of Winogrand himself, just stumbling on this on this moment. And I'm aware we're running out of time already, but I think I just want to say a few more words about this issue that I've touched on, the extent to which certain photographers have previous photographs or previous photographers consciously in their mind. I mean, is it an accident that they end up photographing the same thing? Is there such a thing perhaps as the optical unconscious? Is it, I mean, how deliberate is it? And I'll just close with a number of examples of this which illustrate different levels of consciousness, I guess, on the part of the photographer. So here's a very famous photograph, of course, Roger Fenton from the Crimean War, and it's, you know, there's a huge debate about this picture in itself, which I'm sure you're familiar with, about the extent to which, there are two versions of this picture, lots of argument about the extent to which Fenton and his assistants did or did not rearrange the cannonballs to make it more scenic in a different picture. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. But here's another picture by Paul Seawright, taken in Afghanistan during the Afghanistan War. And I can't remember who now, but somebody told me that after taking this picture, he came dashing back to where they were all saying and said, "I've done it, I've got a Fenton, I've done a Fenton." So very, very conscious in his case. I'm going to go on now to a picture I meant, yeah. So another key image in the book, another sort of originating picture which initiates a whole stream of things, White Fence by Paul Strand. And now we come back to this picture by Edward Weston, which he took in 1937. So I think it's quite an interesting picture, this. I mean, I look at this and I see Strand's fence, and the question is, was Weston conscious of this? Well, I don't know, but he certainly had been conscious of Strand a couple of years before. He was conscious of the way that their careers had in some ways run parallel. He on the Atlantic coast, I on the Pacific, using the same material. And that prompted Weston to ponder further in April 1929 on a slight sort of competitiveness in his own nature. He remembered how, and I'm quoting, months ago he declared that it was immaterial whether one man was greater than another, the important thing being a matter of personal growth. And yet he also remembered how happy he'd been when he came across some lines by a critic declaring that my work was more important than Strand's. Anyway, and then he sort of, he's constantly kind of seeking to improve himself. He's always questioning himself, Weston, and he concluded these reflections by saying, I need to grow beyond personalities. And then 8 years later, it seems to me, maybe this picture of a child's grave shows how he's largely succeeded in this ambition. With this photograph, I think we can say he lays to rest his rather childish rivalry with Paul Strand. Here's another picture of a white fence, and in this case I think there's absolutely no doubt about it. This British photographer Michael Ormerod came to America and was always doing versions of classic American photographs. And I mean, I particularly like the way that here you've got these two little eyes sort of peering out where the posts are broken, as though to sort of emphasize, this is what I'm looking for, this is what I'm seeing. And then another example, there's a bit in the book where I talk about the coming of color photography, and Joel Meyerowitz is part of that generation of the it's what Joel Sternfeld calls the early Christian era of color photography, when this sort of little bunch of converts to colour would all sort of share their faith, and they were all excited about it. And it was a somewhat persecuted faith, because for a long time colour photography had been regarded as vulgar. Anyway, so it was very, very obvious to me that when Meyerowitz took this picture, it was his way of saying, white is a colour too. He saw this white fence. There was a very famous earlier black and white picture of it, and he did this as it's his sort of little visual manifesto in favour of colour photography. It was very obvious to me that that's what it was about. To get permission to reproduce pictures in the book, I often had to get in touch with the photographers and see if I always had to see if it was okay, and some of them asked to see what I'd written. Meyerowitz asked to see what I'd written, where I said something like what I've just said to you, and he wrote back and said, no, I wasn't thinking of that at all, I just thought it was a nice fence. But he let me reproduce it anyway, and in a sense I would say I would still insist on having the last word, because I think at some level it's almost inconceivable that somebody is conscious of the previous history of photography. It's almost impossible that he wouldn't have had that picture of Strands working away in his mind at some point. And then I'll just close this talk by a really clinching image. Sometimes on the back of books for the paperback you quote little bits from the reviews, and obviously they're the bits that say what a great book it is, all this kind of stuff. But this book was really written about quite widely, and there were quite long things written about it. But no review of the book seemed to me to be as incisive or as complimentary or as accurate as this picture, which was sent to me by Richard Misrak when he was down in New Orleans photographing the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And Misrak, my goodness, he really has a deep sense of the tradition, the history of photographers who've come before him. Anyway, so as a kind of just he actually described it as a way of sending me a thank you card for the book, The Ongoing Moment. He sent this picture, and this is the picture I'll leave you with, and this is the end of the formal part, then we can have some questions. But anyway, this is a picture by Richard Misrak. And that is that. So thank you very, very much for listening to me.
Some questions. Thank you so much, Geoff. We're going to pass the mic around because we're recording so you can hear the question. Maybe have a question.
And don't worry if there are no questions, it means you're all free to go and have dinner sooner.
Hi, thanks for coming to Miami. I'm enjoying the book a great deal. And I just have a question about the photography, the people who were photographing blind people. I worked in a school for the blind for 4 years, and I was wondering if you considered that some of these early street photographers found it easy to photograph blind people because they weren't looking back at them, and it was sort of like an easy target.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Absolutely, that. There's this nice phrase of Dorothea Lange's when she talks about, what she wants to do is to become invisible, to don a cloak of invisibility, and yeah. So absolutely, that's right. They don't have to hide. They don't have to hide themselves away. And I think there's a nice sort of corollary there. The way that certain photographers have been really, who've been so keen to photograph other people, have been very, very miserly when it comes to allowing themselves to be photographed. Cartier-Bresson was, famously reluctant to be photographed. But yeah, that's, I think, in a way, the blind person is the ideal subject for many photographers. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Hello. I was wondering what your thoughts are on mobile photography and how it's affecting the photography world as a whole.
Yeah, you mean?
What are your opinions? Cell phone, yeah.
Oh yeah, sure thing. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of it about, obviously, and I think one of the interesting things is that at any one time, at any one period, we tend to associate the look of a period with a particular technology. So you think of the 1960s, and it's that kind of Super 8 look, isn't it? That particular, Super 8. And if you think of think of the Zabruda footage. There it is. It's the very color of memory, isn't it? That weird sort of turquoisey blue. And now the technological look of our time is that of cell phone pictures. And I think what's happened is because so often, if there's a big disaster or event, the first pictures of it tend to be those taken by people with their cell phones. And that's sort of established itself as a kind of, there's an authenticity about that. So then what happens, of course, is it kind of spills on from that, and it turns out that even if they want to be particularly good, they want to be that sort of news photographs need, even if they're taken with expensive cameras, they need to have some of the qualities that we associate with cell phone photography. So I always think of that picture of the picture that won, I think it won the World Press Photo of the Year award, John Moore's photograph of the assassination of Bhutto in Pakistan. And what happened, he heard the shots followed by the explosion, and he just held up his camera, pressed auto wind, and it's all just a very blurry picture, and it's got some of the sort of aesthetic inadequacies of the cell phone, which have come to represent a kind of aesthetic standard as well. So I think that's important. And then I would just repeat, I guess, that comment by, I think it's Gus Powell, who said that, it's so different. For Paul Strand, of course, he was trying to hide the fact that he was taking photographs. Now that's incredibly easy to do. The very difficult thing to do now is to take a picture which doesn't have other people in it taking photographs. and the photographs are all being taken by cell phones. And it's the other thing which is not unique to the cell phone, but is common to all digital things. I think a really important thing is, for years with film, these photographers never knew quite what they got, you know. So you'd take pictures and you wouldn't be quite sure, you know, did you manage to get that moment? And now, of course, that's, you know very quickly whether you've got it or not. And that's why it's quite, you know, if you're in a big city and there's some sort of celebrity thing going on, you know, you've always got these photographers chimping is the phrase they use, you know, looking at turning their cameras upside down like that to see what's going on. So some of that magic of just discovering what you've got in the dark room, as exemplified iconically by the film Blow Up, some of that has gone, I think. So thank you.
Hi, I was wondering if you came across photosynth and those types of things over the last few years.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Just wondering if you were familiar with photosynth.
No, what is that?
Well, it started as 3 guys at the University of Washington. They had a little company called Sea Dragon, and Microsoft bought their company and their technology and integrated into Microsoft Live Labs. But basically what it involves is, it's a different kind of codification of images in terms of their correlative aspects. It has nothing to do with something a human would identify as being a cat or a person or a building. It's more quintessentially the geometrical parameters of the image, which are analyzed by virtue of every photograph, like the photograph you're showing there, is broken into what's called a point cloud model. And that point cloud model is like a very elaborated version of what we used to do as kids, where we would connect the dots. And so you can actually create a point cloud model of that image, which has thousands of dots unconnected, and then have a computer look at another image, which has also been broken into a point cloud model, and find the correlative aspects of it. So effectively, how this makes any sense in the real world is, if I took a photograph, a wide-angle view here, of this room with you and some of the individuals in the foreground, and then I took a detailed photograph of, let's say, the bottle on your desk, there's going to be a geometrical correlative point cloud model in this tight, detailed view of the bottle that corresponds with this large sort of constellation of dots that represent the geometry of this room. A machine can actually determine this very quickly. So in the end, you have a way to meld many, 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 many hundreds or thousands of images. Like, as we speak, there's probably 100 or more people photographing the Eiffel Tower from slightly offset perspectives, some slightly closer, some slightly further back. And this goes on probably 24 hours a day for decades, I'm sure it's been going on. So now we have this family of maybe 50,000 or 100,000 or whatever images of the Eiffel Tower, some close up, some from slightly offset perspectives. But they all have the ability to be brought together as one melding, as one joystickable, zoomable, infinitely zoomable data set. And if you go to Photosynth, you'll see what I'm talking about.
Great, okay. Yeah, I've not heard of that before, but thank you. It sounds amazing.
Any other questions?
Hi, thank you so much for coming tonight. I really enjoyed your talk, but unfortunately I haven't read your book and I'm not too familiar with it. And I was wondering if you could just share what your conclusions were about, I believe image search was the topic of the book or tonight's discussion.
Yeah, actually, it's not a conclusion type book. It's more. God, I'm now trying to think what the opposite of a conclusion type book is. It's more of a kind of a series of speculations, really. Yeah, I think it. Actually, yes. Do you know the last picture in the book is a guy holding up a caption, holding up a sort of a label, just like the blind woman, and it says, "After death, what?" with 2 question marks. I'm just thinking very quickly on my feet now, it seems to me, yes, it was good that that book concluded with that kind of picture as opposed to an answer picture. Yeah, because I think the purpose of the book, it's just to sort of, it's just to throw out a bunch of questions really, and I suppose it all, it's just to.
And has it started a dialogue on?
I'm sorry.
Has it started a dialogue? If the point of the book was to bring up these challenges and open questions, have people responded to it, or how have people?
I kind of think they have really. Yeah. But it's also one of those things, when it's one of those books where it's one of those kind of shit. Why didn't I think of that type books? Because it's such an obvious thing to do, really, and such a simple thing to do. And I promise you, I'm not one of these people where I spend my whole life Googling myself on the internet, but sometimes I do accidentally type in my own name. And it's surprising how much stuff there is now where people have, they've done their own little thread of images, not of hats or whatever it might be, but of some other thing. Or alternatively, they'll take one of the threads that I've initiated of hats, and then they'll say, oh look, this, and that's great. So I like that very much. I guess it's not a conclusion book, and it's not a definitive book. But it's a stimulating book, an eye-opening book, I hope. Geez, I sound like I'm trying to sell it, which I suppose at some awful level I am. Anyway, thank you.
That's going to be our last question, and the book is available
Okay.
in the store. And we all here very much responded to it, and really thank you for your talk, Geoff, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you all. Sure.